The nervous system. This is the body system that controls nearly all of our body's functions. Using the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves located all over our body, these parts allow the rest of our body to communicate with each other and also let the brain know what is happening inside and outside of the body so that it can respond accordingly. As a group, we chose to research this system because of the vast complexity of its operation and its responsibility behind every action that we have made throughout our lives. What's so important about the nervous system is without it, none of our other body systems would function, making it the most crucial system to all organisms. So let's get started in finding out how this intricate system operates.
The nervous system is the center of all actions and all senses. The structure of the nervous system is divided into two main parts, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system's or PNS's main job is to connect the central nervous system to the body's organs, appendages, and its skin. The PNS spans all over where the body can move muscles or sense anything. The PNS is made up of billions of neurons of two types, the motor neurons and the sensory neurons. Specifically, they're axons, which are organized throughout the body in axon bundles until they reach their respective destination. They then branch off to connect to muscles or for sensory neurons to skin. Motor neurons are responsible for signaling all movement in skeletal muscles, like running, punching, grabbing, and general movement of skeletal limbs. Motor neurons in the PNS are the lower part of the motor system, called lower motor neurons. These neurons are responsible for receiving information from the upper motor neurons, which are located in the CNS, specifically the brain. The lower motor neurons receive the information from the upper motor neurons and propagate the signal and send it to the targeted muscle. There are two types of sensory neurons in the PNS. Type A, which feels pain and temperature, and there's type B that senses position, pressure sensations, and sensations of vibration. Both type A and type B neurons are a three-linked system, meaning the nucleus of their first neuron are in the spinal cord and is sent up the brainstem to other neurons in the brainstem. This is for type B. And for type A, the neurons are sent up to the thalamus. The axons of the sensory neurons span to everywhere you feel, first by axon and then transition into dendrites when they reach the specific area that neuron is responsible for sensing. The central nervous system is the engine of the nervous system. The CNS is two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is the main control center for the entire body. It is made up of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is the outermost layer of the brain, made up of billions of neurons, and the white matter is the wiring, connecting the neurons. The brain is responsible for sending instructions to the body and all organs via motor system, and is responsible for receiving information via the sensory system. The brain is divided up into five parts, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and cerebellum. There is also the brainstem, which houses the neurons for the face and head, and it also relays motor nerve fibers from the cortex down to the spinal cord, and relays sensory nerve fibers from the body and limbs up to the cortex. The spinal cord is the other part of the CNS. The spinal cord is the equivalent of an interstate for motor nerve axons to pass from the brain to the body and limbs. It is also for the sensory neuron axons to pass from the body to the brain. The spinal cord connects at the brainstem and reaches down to the lumbar vertebrae, number 1 of the spine.
Each bodily system has its own specialized cells designed specifically to carry out functions for that system. In the nervous system, its two main specialized cells are neurons and glia. The processing of information is carried out by the neurons, and mechanical and metabolic support is carried out by the glia. There are three main categories of neurons, known as receptors, interneurons, and effectors. Receptors are the highly authoritative neurons that encode our sensory information. Interneurons are how signals are sent and received between nerve cells. Effectors send signals to the body's muscles and glands, controlling the body's behavior. All neurons can be divided into three different parts: a cell body, dendrites, and axon. The cell body is where the cell's nucleus is located, along with other structures that are affiliated with the nucleus, such as the mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, and Golgi apparatus. The dendrites and axon help make the neurons unique to other cells in the body. Dendrites extend off of the cell body, and their job is to secure the information from other cells and take the information back to the cell body. The axon is used to acquire the information from the cell body and transfer it to other cells. Most neurons have a single axon but multiple dendrites. Neurons communicate with each other through electrical and chemical signals. The message begins as an action potential, which are electrical messages that are traveling down the neuron. When the action potential makes its way down the neuron, it isn't able to cross the gap onto the neuron receiving the message. So the action potential turns from an electrical message into a chemical message that makes its way onto the neuron receiving the message. This action is called a synapse, which is a name for when one neuron communicates with another. These messages can be made when the body takes in signals from its senses and then processes the information to create a reaction. Neurons are important because they tell your muscles to move fast if, say, you are in a race, or it can make you feel pain to tell you that you are hurt. Any sort of feeling or movement you have is processed and communicated by your neurons and the rest of the nervous system.
Cellular transport is faster than a Ferrari. The whole process of sending an electrical message happens at 250 miles per hour. The neurons are able to do this by a process called depolarization and repolarization. Depolarization is the process of sodium ions flowing from outside the cell membrane to inside the cell membrane through gated channels, allowing the positive electrical state of axons to change from outside the cell to inside the cell temporarily. Repolarization is the process of restoring the original relative positive electrical state outside the axon. This initially is achieved by potassium flowing from inside the axon to outside the axon via gated channels in the axon membrane. The electric message is able to move so rapidly down the axon by a process called saltatory conduction. Saltatory conduction is the process of electric message skipping down the axon in between the myelinated segments of the axon. They skip from one node of Ravenir to the next, all the way down the axon, kind of like skipping a rock on a pond. The node of Ranvier is a bare, unmyelinated, very tiny segment of axon. The final action in the electrical signal transmission is when one cell talks to the next. For example, the upper motor neuron talking to the motor neuron, and then the lower motor neuron talking to the muscle cell. This communication event is called synaptic transport because the electrical message is converted into a chemical message at each synapse in the axon terminals. The electrical signal reaches the axon terminal and causes a release of chemical messenger packets containing acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter or chemical messenger of the motor nerve system. These packets of acetylcholine are received by the chemical receptor structures of the target cell, in this case, the lower motor neuron or the muscle cell. In the lower motor neuron, the chemical message triggers another electrical message down the axon, once again through a process of depolarization/repolarization and saltatory conduction to the muscle cell. In the muscle cell, the chemical message is converted into an electrical message that results in muscle cell contraction.
The nervous system is regulated by its command center, the brain, and uses nearly 100 billion neurons to connect to work with other nerves throughout the body. This is so we can comprehend all the things that we experience in life. In particular, the hypothalamus is able to control physical and emotional stress, alongside emotion, body temperature, appetite, and other natural responses so that we can maintain homeostasis. The nervous system uses many different mechanisms to regulate our lives. The autonomic nervous system works without us being aware or conscious of it. Through its neural connections to parts of the CNS, such as the brain, spinal cord, retina, and nerves, it is able to send neural signals into our lungs, heart, stomach, bladder, and etc. Through these naturally sent neural signals, the autonomic nervous system, which is made up of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions, is able to naturally regulate many body processes, such as blood pressure and breathing rates. Its sympathetic subsystem prepares our active body organs, like our heart rate and our breathing during exercise, alongside our fight or flight reactions. However, its parasympathetic subsystem conserves energy throughout the body, alongside our resting functions such as breathing or digestion. Another example of the nervous system being regulated is through the somatic system. The somatic system is responsible for our senses such as sight, smell, and touch. This works through the brain, the control system, which uses neurons as messengers that bring in messages from our senses for the brain to process and find a reasonable and proper response for the brain to process. The ability for the nervous system to function correctly is essential for our body to be able to properly go through simple actions. Without the nervous system, the human body would simply just be a sitting clump of cells that wasn't able to move or utilize any of its organs. If the human body does not have the nervous system, or doesn't have a properly functioning one, survival is much more difficult, if not impossible. However, there are instances where the nervous system simply cannot function. One example of the nervous system breaking down occurs when seizures take place. During the event of an epileptic seizure, for example, the brain will undergo an intense, random surge of electrical activity and will cause neurons throughout the brain to misfire and mix up its messages. Epilepsy is a very common condition and can be formed due to complications during birth, tumors, strokes, or genetic conditions. Seizures due to the condition can also be triggered by many things, such as stress, drugs, or alcohol, lack of sleep, bright flashing lights, or overwhelming situations. When these occur, the brain simply fails to comprehend the situation and sends an excessive, uncontrolled amount of neurons throughout the brain to try and make up for this failure to comprehend the situation, leading to an overcharge of electric activity in the brain. When the brain is going through a seizure, for example, the body begins to glitch out and falls into a state where it's unable to function. The muscles and joints of the body tense up extremely tightly, and the body can begin to shake very aggressively, which can cause many bones to break.
In humans, there are many genetic diseases that affect the nervous system. For example, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Huntington's diseases are all examples of genetic diseases that affect the nervous system. For our project, we decided to focus on Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia that for adults is the fourth leading cause of death. It is a progressive disease, which means that symptoms start out slow and worsen over time. Victims of Alzheimer's develop issues with cognitive functions such as memory, behavior, and thinking. The risks of developing Alzheimer's grows much larger with age. The cause of late-onset Alzheimer's is not thoroughly discovered yet. All that is known about the cause of late-onset Alzheimer's is a genetic risk factor, which is having a form of the apolipoprotein E gene on the 19th chromosome. Although the cause of late-onset Alzheimer's is still relatively unknown, it is known that early-onset Alzheimer's can be caused by only one of a wide array of mutations that can occur on chromosomes 1, 14, and 21. Mutations on chromosome 1 can lead to abnormal presenilin 2 to be formed. Mutations on chromosome 14 can cause abnormal presenilin 1 to be formed, and a mutation on chromosome 21 can cause abnormal amyloid precursor protein, APP for short, to be formed. These mutations cause different issues with the breakdown of beta amyloid proteins. Beta amyloid proteins are protein fragments taken from APP that our bodies produce and can break down. But when a person has Alzheimer's, their ability to break down these proteins becomes corrupted, and so the fragments group together and form hard plaques in the brain that cause the neurons to lose connection with each other and ultimately die off. Another part of the brain that worsens over time with Alzheimer's are the twisted fibers in the brain's nerve cells known as neurofibrillary fibers. Neurofibrillary fibers are mainly made out of a protein called tau, which is what the microtubules in the protein are formed out of. A microtubule sends important nutrients and substances from one nerve cell to another. Alzheimer's causes the tau protein to become abnormal, which causes the microtubules to break down. The combination of all these things happening to the brain causes the brain tissue to shrink while the brain's ventricles become enlarged. The first symptoms of Alzheimer's occur when the neurons in the hippocampus deteriorate, which causes short-term memory loss. Judgment, language, and emotional issues occur in the victim once Alzheimer's spreads throughout their cerebral cortex. After even more nerve cells die, the victim's actions become nearly unrecognizable, and they soon become dependent on others to take care of them.
The nervous system is involved in nearly every single body system. However, I would like to focus on the narrative that its involvement with the respiratory system, with its relationship to the nose in particular. The nose is very important to the respiratory system because it acts as a direct entryway for oxygen to enter our body, alongside providing us with a sense of smell. The way that we are able to comprehend smell is directly resulted from the nervous system's involvement. Whenever we inhale, we are able to interpret the smell of our environment from the olfactory bulb, which is a structure that is located from the bottom of the frontal cortex. This occurs because when we inhale, the molecules enter into the nasal cavity, where the olfactory nerves will detect the smell and use its axons to send the signal to the bulb, The center of the bulb in particular has a lot of neurons. After the extremely well-organized bulb processes the smell, it sends the reaction through its own nerve tracts to let the rest of the brain know of whether or not the smell is a good or bad one. Once our brain has received the messages, it is able to know whether to avoid certain areas where the smell is putrid or be attracted to other areas where the smell is good. One thing that separates the human olfactory bulb from that of other mammals is that there are no new neurons that form inside of it after birth, whereas many of our other mammal counterparts are able to develop more neurons. This increased number of neurons inside the olfactory bulb in animals, such as dogs, give them superior sense of smell in comparison to our own. As we all know, concussions have very damaging effects on the brain. If you take a look on this graph, you can see on the x-axis it labels as number of concussions, and on the y-axis it's showing the percent of people who are depressed. When you look at people who have at least one concussion, the rates are at about 5% for retired football players. However, as the number of concussions increase, more and more football players who are retired suffer from intense depression. As we all know, it is a major issue in American society. However, did you know that concussions also have an effect on the body's sense of smell? When we go through concussions, it can damage the very delicate olfactory nerves by shaking it too much. This will lead to our brain losing sense of smell directly after a concussion, and it can be disabled for days, weeks, months, or even years at a time.
The evolution of the nervous system is to have started out as a fairly simple system called diffuse nervous systems. Diffuse nervous systems are the most primitive nervous systems. They only have cells that are distributed throughout the organism via a nerve net that distributes the cells beneath the epidermal layer. Diffuse systems like these are found in cnidarians, which would be organisms like jellyfish. The next step of evolution in the nervous systems would be centralized nervous systems. This is the sign of evolution of what can be called a brain. This is seen in an organism called a flatworm. The flatworm has a longitudinal nerve cord and an anterior collection of nerve cells, which can be called a brain. They also have a well-defined sensory and motor pathway and coordinating neurons. Flatworms still have nerve nets, but the brain in the flatworm represents a simple development of the centralized nervous system. The next step is the moderately cephalized system, which is fairly similar to the previous primitive developments of the centralized nervous system, except the introduction of the ventral nerve cords, which are primitive precursors to the spinal cord. The next step is complexly compartmentalized systems. These are more complex brains that have compartmentalization to allow for functions like locomotion and feeding. The next step is the vertebrae system. The nervous systems of vertebrates has two main divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system now has a spinal cord. The next development of evolution is encephalization, which is the addition of the forebrain, and more evolution of the brain, including the early signs of compartmentalization of the brain, such as the hindbrain and cerebrum. Then comes the dominance of the cerebrum. This is now the human brain. The dominance of the cerebrum has now allowed compartmentalization of the brain to be extremely complex, such as the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. These allow for separation of responsibilities and specialization of functions, as shown in the diagram on the left. This superior compartmentalization allows humans to plan and execute activities as well as physically, visually, and verbally interpret stimuli from the environment and communicate that information to other compartments of the brain in the overall condition of human higher executive function.
Here are our sources. Thank you for listening.